The estate rose on the ridge like a manifesto of polished stone, terraces falling away in terraces, glass and silver catching the late sun and throwing it back like a promise. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers scattered light into a constellation of practiced smiles, champagne murmurs, and the soft scrape of polished shoes across oak. There was a thin scent of lemon oil on the banisters, a whisper of jasmine from floral arrangements, and beneath it all, the cool metallic tang of small talk. At the very edge of that choreography, near a bank of heavy curtains that hid a service corridor, a small girl sat with her knees drawn up, spinning a tiny music box on her palm. The music was a fractured lullaby that sounded right at home and painfully out of place. No one noticed the way her fingers moved. No one saw the way her feet tapped a measured rhythm against the carpet, as if tracing an invisible beat. Sofia Rivera adjusted the apron around her waist, the linen whispering like a tide, and felt the usual neutrality of service press against her skin. It was her first week, the agency had said, light and practical, but something in the air made her breathe as if tasting glass. She moved closer to the curtains, feeling the cool of marble under her shoes, and when she crouched, the room shrank to a narrow tunnel of sound. The quartet on the dais thinned to single notes. She said hello like a small key, offering the hand she kept steady, and the girl looked up as though someone had finally opened a window on a house that had been locked for years. Who is she? The question that lodged like a pebble would unfurl into a story nobody expected. The first real exchange began like a soft tread. Sofia. Hi, my name is Sofia. Would you like to come out and see the lights? Emma answered, not with words at first, but with a small tilt of the head, the music box still turning. It is very bright in there. It might be loud. I can stay with you. A woman in a silk gown, Anne Lang, the events coordinator, passed and glanced with the polite avoidance of people trained to glide around discomfort. Excuse me, make sure she stays with Mrs. Alden, please. Mrs. Alden, the head housekeeper, offered a practiced smile and an angle of hand that suggested custody more than care. Mrs. Alden, Emma, sweetheart, come along now. Emma did not rise. Sofia sat on her heels beside the girl and set her tray down with a breath that smelled faintly of warm coffee. Sofia, you like music boxes? Emma turned the little crank, and a note fractured upward. Emma spoke then, small and deliberate, voice neither loud nor invisible. Dance. The single word moved through the room and registered late in the faces above like a delayed note. A guest near the band. Jonathan Myers, an investor and friend of the family, frowned as if someone had touched a public painting. Jonathan, is someone asking for a performance? Liam Carter, the host and father, a man whose suits seemed to have been made of decisions, scanned the crowd and the child, his jaw a geography of caution. Liam, not now, we are entertaining guests. Sofia looked at Liam and then at Emma, and without permission or plan, she offered her hand again. May I? Emma placed her small hand in Sofia's worn palm as if testing a new language. The room inhaled. The music stumbled. For the first time, someone at that table watched. They moved from being observed to acting, and with action, the rules shifted. A waiter knocked a tray. A ripple of interest spread from one gilded face to another. Sofia led Emma into the center of the parquet floor, where light gathered like a circle drawn on purpose. The first steps were tentative, a conversation in motion. There was the faint scratch of taffeta where skirts cleared the floor, the scent of buttered canapes, the distant hum of cars on the drive, the click of a photographer's shutter. A murmured, "How dare you," from a hostess was swallowed by the swell of a violin. A child who had lived in corners for months smiled at something she had never been taught to expect, and that smile made a guest spill a drink, made a man at the piano miss a chord. The scene did not explode. It merely rearranged itself. After the impulse of the ballroom came the first consequence. Liam approached with an economy of words and a severity that had come to govern every personal moment he authorized. Liam, this is my house. Sofia, I know, I am just trying to make her comfortable. Oliver, the butler, stepped forward like a slow-moving plank of authority smoothed by years. Oliver: "Perhaps we should keep the child with Mrs. Alden. Mrs. Alden, it will be easier for everyone." Sofia hesitated. There was an offer implicit in the words of the elder staff, a promise shaped by precedent and taste. Into that softened frame stepped an absence. The music box ticked on Emma's palm, a circular memory of a woman who was not in the room, a mother whose ghost lived in photographs and in a piano bench now mostly polished. Sofia, aware of the fine line between service and intrusion, found her voice. "If no one else will, I will teach her a step or two." The line was not a negotiation so much as a quiet claim. Liam nodded once, non-committal, and walked back into the room where the hum of conversation resumed around a new current of attention. Night fell, and with it a quieter discovery. After the guests left, when the chandeliers were dimmed and the house smelt of lemon oil and a faint hint of burnt toast from the evening's desserts, Sofia found a small cardboard box tucked behind a stack of old sheet music in the drawing room. It was labeled in a woman's handwriting, fragile and slanted, "For Emma." Inside lay a narrow pair of ballet slippers, a pressed program from a recital, and a photograph of a woman with Liam at a gala, a woman whose smile carried a softness the rest of the room lacked. The slippers smelled faintly of powder and worn leather. Sofia sat on the carpet and ran her thumb along the frayed satin, listening to the house breathe. The box became a map, a set of clues folded into the routine. She learned from the program that Grace Carter, the mother, had been a pianist who taught at a conservatory before she had become a figure in philanthropy and then had passed away 3 years earlier. That absence had calcified into protocol. Sofia held the photograph until the image softened into something less like a relic and more like a voice. She understood then that the music box, the slippers, the way Emma watched light were not mere props but anchors for a child learning to find the world again. Sofia's backstory unfolded like a chapter retrieved from a pocket. She had been born in a small apartment above a bakery where the morning smelled of yeast and sugar and the world began with the clink of spoons against china. As a child, she had learned to speak by watching the baker's hands, the way those hands measured kindness by the amount of dough they left to rest. She had studied at a community college and patched shifts as a nanny and an assistant at a daycare while saving for a certificate in early childhood education. Her life had a rhythm of work and study and the small, steady music of meals made for others. Then, 3 years ago, her brother, who had been her closest friend, fell ill, and the small apartment became hard to heat. She took a job far from home, cleaning offices by night, tutoring by day, and learned to keep grief polite and practical. In her 20s, she had taught a group of children with sensory needs at a community center, where she discovered that movement and repetition could unlock walls made of fear. She kept a photograph in her wallet of a small boy named Marco who had learned to clap on time. He had hugged her goodbye like a person who had been given a new map of the world. The training she had accumulated was not glamorous, but it was deliberate. After her brother's funeral, she promised herself she would never let a child be unseen if she could help it. That promise had brought her here, to this polished house with its long corridors and carefully arranged menus, to a job that asked for quiet competence and occasionally required courage. The days that followed were a slow choreography of routine and small glories that built trust. Sofia invented rituals, a sound, the way she warmed the music box before a session, a particular way she tied Emma's hair so the curls bounced in time, a countdown whisper before the first step. Sensory details were used deliberately. There was the scent of talcum used on the slippers, the cool grain of the parquet under bare feet, the soft weight of a flannel blanket used after practice, the tiny metallic click of the music box, and a warm lemon tea brewed from a pot Sofia favored that seeped itself into the edges of the house. Each practice began with listening exercises, where Sofia hummed and Emma matched the pitch with a finger on the carpet. They worked on touch language, a gentle pressure on the wrist signaling turn, a palm placed at the shoulder to invite connection. Their dialogues were quiet and expansive. Sofia, we will take 3 steps now, together. Emma, 3. Sofia, 1, 2, 3, look at me. Emma, step. Sofia, you are doing it. Emma, music. Marisa, a community dance teacher whom Sofia had called in one afternoon, watched with eyes that softened. Marisa, she has rhythm, she is feeling it. Hugo, the gardener, passed by the window and stopped to clap softly to encourage them. Oliver would sometimes poke his head in, his face unreadable, and offer a small nod that in time became a smile. The household began to notice. The maid carried a patience that was practical and brave. The child responded in little increments of brightness. And the father, Liam, watched from a distance like a man learning a new pattern. Then came the first large test. Liam received a phone call from a board member, a demand for presence at a conference that conflicted with an evening performance Sofia had arranged in the greenhouse for a small circle of people who mattered to Emma. The board wanted protocol, prestige, and an image that did not include small disruptions. Liam stood in the study, the paper of the call still warm in his hand. He said, "We cannot have something unsanctioned here." Sofia said, "The greenhouse is safe and intimate. She will do fine." Oliver advised caution. Mrs. Alden suggested postponement. Dr. Patel, the pediatrician, had given conditional approval for a private recital if the environment remained calm. The tension was not violent, so much as administrative cruelty. Liam wrestled with memory, a ghost of his wife standing in a kitchen, a melody on a piano bench, then the hollow of loss that had taught him to manage pain by scheduling it. For 2 paragraphs the argument was procedural and cold. Then, in a private moment by the study window, Liam remembered a video he had saved of Grace at a small recital, her hands shaping a slow arpeggio, while the camera had captured a laugh that softened everything around her. That memory became a hinge. He said, finally, "Do it. Keep it small. Invite only those I choose." The choice was a restriction and an opening. Sofia breathed as if released from underwater and began to plan with care. The reconciliation and preparation for the greenhouse performance were meticulous and tender. They chose guests deliberately: Mrs. Alden, Oliver, Marisa, Dr. Patel, Hugo, Jonathan Myers, and 2 neighbors who had known the family for years, Evelyn and Marco Ruiz. Invitations were delivered in person with a softness that made protocol feel like courtesy rather than rule. Rehearsals became sacred for Emma. Sofia taught small sequences of movement linked to stories about the slippers and the music box. Curfew times were shifted. The greenhouse smelled of damp earth, warm glass, and the subtle honey of late chrysanthemum. Lights were strung like captive stars. The team prepared a playlist that recalled the mother's favorite pieces, and a sheet of notes with simple cues in large print. Sofia and Marisa ran through the routine with repeated sensory anchors, 5 to 6 times each session. The press of a hand on the back, the click of a shoe, the rasp of breath before a turn, the soft chime of a bell that signaled applause or rest, the cool touch of a ribbon. Conversations during this phase were plentiful and deep. Marisa: "She is ready, the timing is there." Sofia: "She knows the pattern if we give her the space." Mrs. Alden: "I will stand at the doorway. If she needs me, I will be there." Oliver: "Your arrangement seems sensible." Liam came by once to watch, and left with a folded expression, an attempt at visible feeling that was still new to him. There were small triumphs. Emma followed a rhythm, nodded at the end of a sequence, laughed at a patch of light that moved on the floor. Each success rearranged the house's habits. Then the public test arrived. The greenhouse performance was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon, a small gathering meant to be private, but inevitably intimate. The room held the smell of soil and citrus, the glass magnified expressions until they looked like something sculpted. The audience arrived, names folding into the space. Liam Carter, Oliver, the butler, Mrs. Alden, Marisa, Dr. Patel, Hugo, Jonathan, Evelyn, Marco Ruiz, and a neighbor named Denise who had once taught at a nursery. When Emma entered wearing the little slippers and the music box warm in her palm, a hush fell like a drawn curtain. The first movement was soft, a series of steps aligned with a single quiet melody. The sensory detail of the moment was acute. The soft scuff of satin on glass, the sunlight reduced to warm pools, the faint scent of lavender from a sprig Sofia had tucked under Emma's collar, the slight metallic ring as the music box finished a loop, the rustle of breath from friends held on purpose. The crowd's faces were close enough to read and far enough to remain honest. Then a misstep happened. A small falter. That would, in another house, have become proof of inability. Emma paused, looked at Sofia, and the room leaned in. The climax in front of guests demanded dialogue and disclosure, and a succession of exchanges that unseated old rules. Sofia whispered, "Take my hand and feel the floor." Emma answered with a small, solid, "Okay." Marisa clapped softly in rhythm, 1, 2, 3, again. Emma, more confident, said, "Again." Mrs. Alden murmured, "Good girl," the words thick with approval. Oliver, who had rarely shown emotion, wiped his eye discreetly and said, "She is like her mother." Dr. Patel observed clinically but kindly, "She responds to consistent cues." Hugo, his dirt under his fingernails and his hands like a map of the earth, laughed softly and said, "I always thought plants loved applause, but people do too." Jonathan, who had been a skeptical presence, leaned forward and said, "Look at that step. Is that a turn?" Denise sniffed and said, "We all needed that." Liam, who had watched most of the time with his arms folded, stood up in the middle of the performance, voice low but carrying, "Emma." The single name was an invitation and an apology and a reclaiming all at once. Emma stopped, pointed, and then, with a voice clear enough to be heard in the glass, said, "Daddy, watch me." The room closed around them in a sound that was not exactly applause, but a held breath and then warmth. People began to clap, some cried, some laughed, and somewhere in the rhythm of that response, a father who had built his life on boards and spreadsheets learned how to stand inside a room without armor. After the applause subsided, came a period of consequences, concrete and small. Liam approached Sofia, and their exchange had the edges of an agreement. Liam, "You kept your promise and gave her a place." Sofia, "She gave me more than I imagined." Liam, "I would like to formalize something, a position for you, part-time with a stipend for classes and an assistant." Sofia looked at the paper he drew from his pocket, the words a practical envelope around an emotional truth. Oliver and Mrs. Alden signed on as references. Marisa offered to continue teaching pro bono for the first months as the house settled into this new role. Dr. Patel suggested a plan for sensory supports and a modest scholarship in Grace's name. Jonathan offered funding for future community recitals. Names multiplied, and the network began to feel less like a protective barrier and more like a bridge. The moment of reconciliation was not cinematic in a single frame, but composed of tiny administrative steps that proved intention had teeth. There were, however, moments of tension after the acclaim, each a test of resolve and memory. The first was a board meeting where investors questioned the optics of publicizing the family's private adaptation, and Liam felt the old impulse to contain feelings by burying them under corporate decisions. He considered rescinding the offer to Sofia to avoid what he called complications. In a conversation heavy with professional language, he said, "This might distract from our quarterly projections." Sofia, who had been careful with calculations and not led by sentiment, nevertheless said, "This is not about optics. It is about a child learning to be seen." The exchange left both of them in a silence as loud as a door slamming. The second tension arrived when a neighbor anonymously complained about the greenhouse gatherings, calling them disruptive. The complaint triggered a defensive reaction from Oliver, who feared for his job if the estate became the subject of rumor. Mrs. Alden feared a return to the old order. Sofia found herself in a place she had not planned for, advocating not just for a child, but for an institutional change. Each tension lasted and required work, a series of small decisions that proved endurance matters more than a single heroic moment. Memories of the mother, of a time when songs were commonplace in the house, became both shelter and provocation. The family and staff chose to respond with transparency and invitations rather than silence, turning conflict into an opportunity to explain rather than to hide. The reconciliation deepened over weeks of patient work. Liam attended a therapy session with Dr. Patel, where he spoke, halting and then with surprising clarity, about grief he had scheduled and deferred. He said, "I did not know how to be small when everything else demanded I be large." Dr. Patel replied, "Being present is not weakness, it is a skill you can learn." That phrase guided him back into practice. Sofia received a formal offer letter that named her as a familial educator and liaison to the conservatory programs the house would sponsor. The household introduced small institutional shifts, scheduled sensory hours in the greenhouse, a fund named for Grace to sponsor lessons for children with special needs, training sessions led by Marisa and Dr. Patel for staff, and a community recital calendar. Names that had previously been decorative became active participants. Mrs. Alden hosted a small after-school tea for parents. Hugo organized a corner of the garden for free play with textured paths. Oliver began to document routines and cues in a book that became a manual for the household. The ritual of practice turned into a program. The decision to transform a one-off act into a responsibility solidified the change and made it sustainable. The epilogue spread out in months and small gestures that had large meaning. 1 month later, the greenhouse hosted its first scheduled class, open to 3 neighborhood children. The house smelled like toast and oranges, and parents approached the conservatory notes with gratitude. Sofia juggled the lessons and a modest stipend, balancing schedules with a competence that made her look less like a temporary and more like a steward. Liam sent a formal thank you memo to the board and a private email to investors with photos that
showed a softer side that did not hurt the company's image but humanized it. Mrs. Alden started accompanying children to class, carrying a thermos of tea as if it were a flag of care. 3 months in, the ripple had grown measurable. A small foundation had offered a grant in Grace's name, funding a scholarship for 5 children to receive movement therapy. Jonathan worked with a local nonprofit to create a public recital series that kept the intimate ethos intact while widening access. Marisa and Dr. Patel offered workshops that trained other household staff in sensory-friendly practices. Oliver's manual had become a resource for other estates seeking inclusive practices. The list of names involved now read like a community ledger. Evelyn Ruiz coordinated volunteer transport. Marco Ruiz taught rhythm games. Denise organized a parent support circle. Liam himself began to attend more than he had scheduled, sometimes sitting in the back and clapping with a bright wetness in his eyes. 6 months later, the change had become habit. The greenhouse had a plaque in Grace's memory. The scholarship had been renewed, and Sofia had accepted a permanent role that included designing outreach programs. Emma had a circle of friends and a small troupe that performed at local charity events. The house was quieter and kinder in ways that were as practical as they were profound. In the end, the most visible change was not a headline, but the way the family learned to inhabit ordinary acts differently. Liam still closed deals and sat through meetings, but he now also learned to show up for a Tuesday rehearsal, to watch a small sequence of steps and say nothing but applaud at the end. Sofia had not set out to transform a dynasty. She had set out to be steady, to keep promises she made to children long ago, and that steadiness proved contagious. The music box continued to spin on Emma's shelf, its small melody a recurring motif that reminded everyone what had changed. Mrs. Alden, Hugo, Marisa, Oliver, Dr. Patel, Jonathan, Evelyn, and Marco remained people who witnessed and who acted, their names now woven into a narrative of repair. The final picture was of Emma in a patch of sunlight, ballet slippers dusted with garden soil, holding Sofia's hand and saying, with a voice that had grown in its courage, "Dance with me." When a stranger chooses to see what others do not, entire houses can learn to resize their hearts. If this story touched you, subscribe for more accounts of how small acts create lasting rooms for belonging.